Did you know that well over half of all carpal wrist fractures are due to the same small bone being broken each time? It is interesting to note the orientation of this bone during the fall is the primary reason for the fracture. Wouldn't it be powerful if by simply teaching individuals how to fall in a safer manner, we could prevent the vast majority of these fractures? Hi, my name is Elizabeth Finley. I'm from Glenbrook South High School in Glenview, Illinois, and today I will be talking about my paper, Preventing Scaphoid Injuries from Falls. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Mr. Rylander who guided me through the research process and provided advice to me in writing this paper. He was instrumental throughout this entire project and led me to where I am today. Thank you. Now, just over a year ago, I fractured my scaphoid in a fall that occurred during basketball. The fracture was painful, required significant physical therapy, and prevented me from playing basketball and engaging in so many activities that I enjoy. Because of this personal experience, I wanted to prevent others from experiencing what I and so many others experience every year. And so, the purpose of my research was to understand how changing the way a person falls affects the amount of force imposed on the scaphoid, a tiny bone in the wrist that is responsible for many fractures from falls. There are three main hypotheses. They were, as the wrist falls from greater heights, the scaphoid will experience larger amounts of force. As the wrist approaches a rotated angle of 45 degrees for the angle model experiments, and a rotated angle of negative 45 degrees for the opposite angle model experiments, the amount of force imposed on the scaphoid will increase. And as the surface that the wrist comes in contact with throughout the experiment rotates to be at angles with greater magnitudes, the force on the scaphoid will become larger. Let's start off with some background information. First, wrist anatomy. The wrist joint is composed of the distal parts of the ulna and radius and the 8 carpal bones. These 8 carpal bones include the lunate, the tracheum, the pisiform, the capitate, the trapezium, the trapezoid, the hamate, and the scaphoid. The 8 carpal bones are arranged in 2 rows, the proximal row which has the scaphoid, the lunate, the tracheum, and the pisiform, and the distal row which has the hamate, the capitate, the trapezoid, and the trapezium. The scaphoid is the largest carpal bone and crosses both rows. The scaphoid coordinates the position and motion of the other wrist bones and transfers the load from the hand to the forearm, making it essential for wrist stability. The wrist joint has many ligaments. One of these ligaments is the scaphoid-trapezoidal ligament, which connects the distal pole of the scaphoid bone with the trapezoid and trapezium bones. There is also the radioscaphocapitate ligament, which connects the scaphoid and the capitate. Thirdly, the scapholunate ligament binds the lunate and the scaphoid together. The scaphoid bone is especially vulnerable to fractures. It is the most common carpal bone to be involved in fractures, as about 60% of carpal fractures and about 11% of all hand fractures are scaphoid fractures. This type of injury commonly occurs after people fall and land on their outstretched hands. This type of falling onto outstretched hands ensures that the wrist and the arm take on the full impact force. These foosh, or fall into an outstretched hand injuries, often affect the scaphoid and lead to a fracture because of the scaphoid's role as the main connection between the forearm and the hand. What follows is a description of the experiments I performed to investigate the force on the scaphoid in various falls for the purpose of being able to prevent such fractures from happening in the future through simple education. These experiments did not require many materials. Indeed, the only materials that were needed were a computer, the interactive physics application, a calculator, and a piece of paper outlining the experiments to be performed. The first step was to design the models. I used the curved polygon drawing tool to design a polygon representing the carpal bones, not including the scaphoid. This polygon is the larger orange polygon in the models below. I also used the curved polygon drawing tool to design a polygon representing the scaphoid. This polygon is a smaller orange polygon in the models below. I used relations with actual wrist anatomic values to design these polygons as close as possible to the actual wrist anatomy. The first experiment I did was the angle experiment. Here is a video of the angle Model 1 experiment at 60 degrees. For this experiment, the independent variable was the angle that the model was rotated to. The dependent variable was the total force on the scaphoid in newtons. Controlled variables were the height of the model and the angle of the block or the surface. The angle experiments involved rotating the model counterclockwise. On the screen you can see how the angle experiments at 0 degrees, at 60 degrees, and at 9 degrees were designed. The second experiment was the opposite angle experiment. Here is a video of the opposite angle Model 1 experiment at negative 60 degrees. For this experiment, the independent variable was again the angle of the model. The dependent variable was the total force on the scaphoid in newtons, and controlled variables were the height of the model and the angle of the blocks. The opposite angle experiments involved rotating the model clockwise. On the screen you can see how the opposite angle experiments at negative 0 degrees, negative 60 degrees, and negative 9 degrees were designed. The third experiment was the height experiment. Here is a video of the height Model 1 experiment at 5 meters. The independent variable for this experiment was the height of the model. The dependent variable was the total force on the scaphoid in newtons, and controlled variables were the angle of the model and the block. Here is a still from one of the height experiments. The fourth experiment was the block experiment. Here is a video of the block Model 1 experiment at 10 degrees. The independent variable was the angle of the block. The dependent variable was the total force on the scaphoid in newtons. Controlled variables were the angle and the height of the model. On the screen you can see how the block experiments at 5 degrees and negative 5 degrees were designed. The results of the angle experiments saw the one maximum force on the scaphoid generally increase to a peak angle and then generally decrease after this peak angle. For Model 1, the one maximum force on the scaphoid generally increased in magnitude from 8 degrees up to 55 degrees and then decreased in magnitude from 55 degrees back down to 15 degrees. The maximum force peak for Model 1 was 55 degrees. For Model 2, the one maximum force on the scaphoid increased in magnitude from 9 degrees up to 60 degrees and then decreased in magnitude from 60 degrees back down to 20 degrees. The maximum force peak for Model 2 was 60 degrees. The results of the opposite angle experiments also saw the one maximum force on the scaphoid generally increase to a peak angle and then generally decrease after that peak angle. For Model 1, the one maximum force increased in magnitude from negative 75 degrees up to negative 55 degrees and then decreased in magnitude from negative 55 degrees back down to negative 0 degrees. The maximum force peak for Model 1 was negative 55 degrees. For Model 2, the one maximum force on the scaphoid increased in magnitude from negative 75 degrees up to negative 60 degrees, then decreased in magnitude from negative 60 degrees back down to negative 0 degrees. The maximum force peak for Model 2 was negative 60 degrees. The results for the height experiment saw the one maximum force generally increase as the height increased. For Model 1, the one maximum force increased in magnitude from 1.5 meters to 7.5 meters overall. For Model 2, the one maximum force generally increased in magnitude from 2 meters to 8 meters. The results for the block experiments generally saw the one maximum force go through 3 major shifts between increasing force and decreasing force. For Model 1, its trend consisted of 3 peaks at negative 25 degrees, 0 degrees, and 20 degrees, where the one maximum force changed from increasing magnitude to decreasing magnitude. For Model 2, its trend consisted of 3 main peaks at negative 30 degrees, 0 degrees, and 15 degrees, where the one maximum force changed from increasing magnitude to decreasing magnitude. The main sources of error that might have affected the conclusion were connected to the design of the models. One source of experimental error with the models was scaling error, which occurred due to the type of computer program that was used. Since this computer program was set up in the units of meters and kilograms instead of the more relatable anatomical units of millimeters and grams, the masses of the two polygons and the lengths of the springs in the program required approximations found from scaling everything up. Another potential source of error comes from the design and the shape of the polygons that make up the models used in these experiments, as they are done with freehand computer drawing and are thus not entirely anatomically accurate. A third possible source of error revolves from the designed ligaments, as approximations for the ligaments that are designed as springs were made of Hooke's law and given K values. However, it is unlikely that these possible sources of error mess up the overall takeaways and trends seen in the data. One way in which the error with the design of the models could have been avoided is through the utilization of a different computer program that allowed for more accurate models of the wrist. Besides these potential sources of error with the design of the models, there weren't many other possible points of error. While most projects usually have possible measurement errors in their results, these experiments did not have that, as the data came from interactive physics, which is a computer program. In conclusion, with the knowledge of the results of these experiments, it can be determined that one can decrease the amount of force applied on their scaphoid by not falling out onto their hands with their wrists extended. Instead, one should try to fall on their side, avoiding putting immense force on their hands and wrists. However, if you are falling forward and you can't change the rotation of your body and you have to land on your hands, don't stick your hands out fully extended, don't keep your arms stiff, and bend your arms when making contact with the ground. While this research and education could have prevented me from experiencing a scaphoid fracture, I did not know that there are better ways to fall. Yet, I hope that in some small way, this research might help others. But remember,